Welcome back to the Human Perspective. Captioning will be up in 24 hours. This month we will be focusing on the 40th anniversary of the signing of the regulations of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Section 504 says, and I quote, "No otherwise qualified handicapped individual in the United States shall solely on the basis of his handicap be excluded from the participation, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance." This was a monumental piece of legislation. 40 years ago today, the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities, otherwise known as the ACCD, sponsored demonstrations in 10 cities around the United States, trying to force the Carter administration to sign the regulations in the form they were in. One of the demonstrations was in Washington, D.C., at the then Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Our guest today is John Wodatch, who worked for the federal government for more than 40 years before his retirement in 2011. He was one of the lead government lawyers who worked on the development of the regulations for Section 504, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and was a part of the U.S. delegation working on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities between 2002 and 2006. It's typical for the United States, after a law is passed, to develop something that we call regulations, which further elaborate the law. And this was a complicated process. I'd like to welcome John today, who will help us get some background information. So, John, 40 years ago today was the beginning of the demonstrations, and ACCD was in your building. I'm wondering if you could share with the audience what the mood was like in the building from the perspective of government workers and from the perspective of the disabled people from disability rights organizations. What did the organizations want?
Well, we had been working on these regulations. The law was passed in 1973. So it was 4 years from when the law was passed and there were no regulations out. The disability community had worked and pushed the Nixon and then the Ford administration to get the regulations out. They had been out for comment. People knew what they were comfortable with them. At the end of the administration, they refused to put them out. The new Democratic administration came in, the Carter administration. Joe Califano was secretary, and the disability community thought, all right, the first week or second week, the regs would be out. It didn't happen. Joe Califano, a Democrat, looked at it and said, you want me to put out regulations done by a Republican administration? So he began a process to look at it. The disability community felt that they had been let down. They thought that they were going to have these regulations. And so we began a process in the administration of looking at them. David Tatel, who you may know, who was an attorney who is a judge today, he's blind, was hired to look at the regs and tell Joe Califano whether they were okay. So he blessed them in the end, but it took a while, and the disability community couldn't take it anymore and began the demonstrations. The mood that you asked about, it's interesting because you had the HEW, the agency, was full of new Democratic appointees who were used to being the people protesting, not the people being protested against. They couldn't believe it. It gnawed away at them that they were sitting there and they were being protested against.
And how did Califano himself feel about this?
He was not a happy person by this, because they had, at one point, you may remember this, there were demonstrations at his home. And he, that infuriated him. He said, in the worst days of Jim Crow, no one ever went to the homes of people to protest. He just felt it was unfair.
So I was a part of the group that went to his house. And I was actually with another lawyer who went to his house twice. And the second time I went to his house, a lawyer and myself went up to the alleyway and went to knock on the door to see if he would come out and talk with us. He didn't. Could you tell us what regulations are and what made the 504 regulations so important?
You read the words of 504. There are very few. So a regulation has to flesh that out. What is discrimination on the basis of disability? Who's covered? Who are people with disabilities to be covered by this law? There was a lot of ground to be covered. And so the regulations are a way to make it understandable and make it enforceable. So entities that are covered know what they have to do, so people with disabilities know what their rights are.
And what were some of the particularly difficult issues?
Oh, the definition of disability always, and it is around the world now with countries that are implementing the CRPD, but I think 504 led the way in showing that the definition should be comprehensive. This is a civil rights law. It should encompass the full range of people with disabilities, physical disabilities, psychosocial, psychiatric, sensory disabilities. The entire range of it is meant to be covered.
Including HIV/AIDS.
Including, at that point, that didn't exist, but including contagious diseases, and then the coverage of people who are HIV positive. The other issue is, what is discrimination? And just treating people with disabilities the same as everyone else was not enough for 504. Building a building with steps has to be an act of discrimination. So coming up with that concept, you know it as reasonable accommodation, was a very important part of the law, as was the requirement that people should be integrated together with their non-disabled peers.
So what role did 504 play in the development of the Americans with Disabilities Act?
Oh, I think it was a crucial role. 504 set the stage, but it also set the basic concepts. Comprehensive definition of persons with disabilities, broad coverage of what non-discrimination is, effective enforcement is key.
Give us an example of effective non-discrimination.
Well, effective
what an effective
non-discrimination. Yes. Well, think of having sign language interpreters in colleges and universities in 1977 was an idea that no one had thought about. People understood, all right, stairs were wrong, but they didn't understand what we now think of in terms of web access, or in terms of ensuring that people who are blind or have low vision have equal access to the printed word.
Or learning disabilities.
And learning disabilities. I think one of the major things we have seen, 11% of the students in our colleges this past year are students with disabilities. Most of those are students with learning disabilities. It's a huge shift from when we began.
Right. If you learned as you travel around the world, working with disability organizations and governments, what messages would you like to give them about how they should be moving forward in developing and implementing legislation?
One thing they have to do is listen to their disability communities in their own countries. They are sources of information, they're sources of what are needed. But looking at a broad definition of disability, separating the concept of Social Security and payments from the idea of civil rights. Disability rights are civil rights, and that is essential for these countries to understand.
So in the United States, if you're defined as having a disability under the ADA, under the Section 504 or ADA, that doesn't give you a right to be able to get financial benefits, right?
No. And in U.S. law, there are over 150 definitions of disability for different kinds of statutes. The important thing is that civil rights law is different than all of these grant programs.
As a non-disabled lawyer who could have focused on issues other than disability, what motivated you to focus your entire professional career on advancing the civil and human rights of disabled people?
Well, I think my parents were immigrants to this country, and so I had imbued with the sense that this is a wonderful country and it offers opportunity for everyone. But you got to see that it didn't offer full opportunity for women, for people of color, for people who came from other countries, for people with disabilities. And that motivated me to try and make what is a wonderful country a better country.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask the audience to participate in sharing information about 504 stories that you may have. And if you could please put those stories into the comment section below. We will all learn from your stories. And I'd like to thank you for joining the Human Perspective. As I continue to develop our Facebook Live programming, I welcome your thoughts and suggestions, as well as questions. I also invite you to follow me on Twitter @JudithHeumann. I look forward to our next conversation in 2 weeks. Have a good night, and please share this with friends.